Friends, good evening. It's good to be with you tonight. I always feel a twinge of something when Jesus talks about the hairs on our heads. I don't know what it is. He mentions it a lot. Well, it's good to be with you. We're celebrating the 33rd Sunday at Ordinary Time, and as I said at the beginning of Mass, we're so blessed to be accompanied by the Eternum Choir from Lakewood, this amazing sacred music choir under the directorship of James Flood. So thank you all for accompanying us with your beautiful gift tonight. So as the church ends the liturgical year, we're preparing for Christ the King Sunday next weekend, and then, if you can believe it, the weekend after that, we're into the first Sunday of Advent already. It's amazing. But as we get towards the end of the liturgical calendar, the church's readings and the tone of the liturgy becomes more and more apocalyptic. Perhaps you felt that with the readings we just had, especially that first reading from Malachi, right? The day of the Lord coming like fire, right? In the gospel, we just heard Jesus prophesying the end times, the total destruction of the temple, all that means. It would require at least a graduate course or two on this section of the Gospel of Luke alone to really unpack what Jesus is getting at. In fact, Dr. Brant Petrie, who's a huge inspiration of mine, he wrote his doctoral dissertation on just one verse, one line from this gospel. So there's a lot of riches here that you can mine. I'm going to be barely scratching the surface this evening. I promise we're not going to be here 3 hours. But I want to talk about the history that's involved here. I want to talk about the spiritual significance, in particular about the temple again, and the Lord's words, what all of that means for us. So just to, again, jog your memory, from last weekend, we had that the providential arrangement of feasts. That last weekend was the feast of the dedication of the Lateran Basilica, if you recall. That was last weekend. And in my homily last weekend, I spoke about the significance of the temple, right? Because that's what the readings were all highlighting, the temple, all of the significance of the temple. The temple was, for Israel, it was the place of not just right worship, it was the economic, political, religious center of the universe. It was everything. I shared that one image from that one rabbi. He said the temple is the belly button, the navel of the cosmos. I'm still laughing about that. It's just me. You guys don't seem to find that funny. Anyway, the temple in the mind of Israel was a microcosm, right? It was decorated with all these signs and images that were evocative of creation, especially Genesis 1 and 2. So the temple was a microcosmos, and the same thinking was the universe, the cosmos, was a macro temple. Genesis 1 and 2, it's describing this temple architecture, this temple construction. And so, you have, again, the temple was a microcosm. So the temple was, in the mind of the Jews, it was a small-scale universe. Small-scale universe. And so, here you have in the gospel, Jesus and his apostles, they're in the temple area complex. You got these country boys admiring the grandeur of the temple. Oh, it's so beautiful, costly stones, votive offerings. And Jesus, almost casually, he just says, all that you see here, the days will come when there will not be left one stone upon another stone that will not be thrown down. Like, we can't begin to wrap our heads around how jarring that would have been for them. Like, he's prophesying the dissolution and the destruction of the temple, which could mean only one thing in the minds of his Jewish hearers. When they hear the dissolution, destruction of the temple, they're hearing the dissolution and the destruction also of the created order as we know it. Everything is being folded up. And they're asking, rightly so, kind of appalled and terrified, when will this happen? And how are we going to know what's happening? What signs will accompany this? They want to be prepared. And so he tells them there's going to be tremendous suffering, tremendous upheaval, tremendous disturbance, all of these things. Then he says this, they will seize and persecute you. They will hand you over to the synagogues and to prisons, and they will have you led before kings and governors because of my name. It will lead to your giving testimony. Martyrion in the Greek. It's where we get the same word, martyrdom. It will lead to your martyrdom, witness, your testimony, your martyrdom. And friends, I don't know how much of a student of history you are, but that happened. Everything he prophesied, it took place almost literally verbatim as he described it in the spring of the year 70 AD, about 40 years after the Lord's resurrection. At the time of Passover, when there were millions upon millions of Jewish pilgrims streaming into the city of Jerusalem The Roman general Titus, under the Emperor Vespasian, he ordered about 48,000 troops to encircle the city of Jerusalem. And they built this wall, this fortress essentially surrounding the city so that no one could go in and no one could escape. And they starved the place. It was a tremendously horrific experience. They starved. They turned to cannibalism. The Roman historian Josephus, he says that approximately 1.1 million died in this siege, this destruction. It was in August, the Romans breached the walls and they stormed the Temple Mount and they burned the temple to the ground. The only remnant that remains, of course, is that western wall that's in the city of Jerusalem, the Wailing Wall. I've been there twice. That's the only remnant that remains. It was razed, leveled to the ground. Millions slaughtered. To say that this was cataclysmic is such a gross understatement. Like the dissolution of the temple was akin to the dissolution of the cosmos, the entire created order. It signaled, as Jesus prophesied, the beginning of the end. The beginning of the end, the old order passing away. So go back to the gospel that we had last week, where Jesus is in the temple area. He flips over the money changers and he says, "Destroy this temple in 3 days and I will raise it up." And they're confused. This has been under construction for 46 years. You're going to raise it up in 3 days? And then John adds the editorial note. He was speaking of the temple of his body. He was speaking of the temple of his body. So track with me on this. So the destruction of the temple body of Christ on the cross in his passion, which preceded by about 40 years the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. It was that act outside of the city walls of Jerusalem on that Friday we called Good on Calvary Hill, his paschal sacrifice, what we call the paschal mystery, the suffering, death, the resurrection of Jesus, that act it ushered in the end times. It ushered in the end times. So what does all that mean? It means, as the Catechism says, this is paragraph 585. Again, I'll pause if you want to jot that down. Okay. Just keep going. 585. On the threshold of his passion, Jesus announced the coming destruction of this splendid building, of which there would not remain one stone upon another. By doing so, he announced a sign of the last days, which were to begin with his Passover. In other words, the church has been in the end times since Christ's sacrifice on Calvary. All the books and online prophets talk about, are these the last days? Are we in the end times? What's going on with the moon? All these wars, are we in it? No, we've been in it since Calvary, since his paschal sacrifice. And by the end times, we mean the final stages of this plan of loving goodness that's been unfolding from the Father's heart from the beginning to unite all things to himself. That's the plan. That's where all this is headed. From the resurrection onward, the church, right, Christ's body now on earth, the church has been suffering throughout history just as he predicted. In every age, those who conform themselves to Christ have been hauled before kings and magistrates and governors. They have suffered. They have spilled their blood. They have given witness in martyrdom and testimony. In every age, the church, his body, has been following her head in his paschal mystery. The body's going the way of the head. And it's been happening since Calvary. It's a journey through suffering into glory. Good Friday into Easter Sunday. We don't get to bypass that. We're part of it. We're part of it. I'll put it this way. I think it's very common for Christians to have this mindset that man, if we could just only get our act together in the church, then we could really evangelize the world and we can convert everybody and everything. And then eventually we would enter into this new golden age of Christianity where the church is just sailing across the sea of history like one of those, awesome Caribbean cruise liners with a water slide. I think that's what people think. When in reality, the church sailing through history, we look like a broken down schooner with holes in our hull, with a broken rudder and The rigging is tearing, the sails are torn. Like we look like Captain Jack Sparrow coming into Port Royal with the ship sinking. Some of you get the analogy, a lot of you don't. I get it. That's what we look like. That's what we look like. There is no great ascendancy. There's only conformity to Christ, this suffering Messiah who brings us to his Father. Here's another haunting paragraph from the Catechism. This is paragraph 767. The church will enter the glory of the kingdom only through this final Passover. What was the Lord's Passover? His suffering, death, his rising. The church will enter the glory of the kingdom only through this final Passover, when she will follow her Lord in his death and resurrection. The kingdom will be fulfilled then not by a historic triumph of the church through a progressive ascendancy, but only by God's victory over the final unleashing of evil, which will cause his bride to come down from heaven. God's triumph over the revolt of evil will take the form of the last judgment after the final cosmic upheaval of this passing world. I know that's a lot. I just want to linger there for just a moment. The final unleashing of evil, it leads to what? To what the Bible calls the marriage supper of the Lamb. That's what the book of Revelation is revealing. That's where all of this is headed. That's what heaven is. It's the consummation of the bridegroom with the bride, the heavenly marriage feast where God unites all creation to himself. That's where all of this is headed. Like the destruction of the temple, the ushering in of the end times, the church's pilgrimage through suffering, conformity to Christ, all of this is headed to the fulfillment of Christ uniting creation to himself, recreating this world, new heavens and new earth. It's not this etch-a-sketch plan to history. He's not just erasing it. It's not deleted. It's going to be completed. That's the destiny of creation. Creation is not going to be deleted. It's going to be completed. When and how? When God's fire of love, that we heard in that first reading from Malachi, when the fire of God's love touches and remakes everything in creation, every person, every tree, every stone and rock and mountain and blade of grass, everything that he's declared good is going to be redeemed. All creation is groaning, Paul says, for the redemption. And where does it begin? It begins here. This is ground zero for the recreation of the cosmos upon every altar. Because what's about to happen is the fire of God's love that Malachi talked about is going to come down upon little bits of creation, a little piece of bread and a little bit of wine. To speak about bread, to speak about wine is to invoke wheat and grape and vine and earth and sun and soil and quite literally the entire cosmos. To speak about bread and wine is to speak about all of creation. And right here on this altar, the fire touches and transforms and changes creation into Christ. He's uniting it to himself, not obliterating it, not dissolving it, but uniting it to himself. And then we come forward to consume this little bit of divine fire so that we are then transformed, so that we go forth from these doors in this church to be agents of recreation, to bring the light, the love, the glory, the beauty of the resurrected Christ into every nook and cranny where we happen to be. If the only thing that changes at Mass is the bread and wine, not you and me, then we're doing something wrong. We are also supposed to be changed, touched, transformed, and sent out. And sent out. May that be true for us in this Mass today.